Hello, and welcome to the Art and Science of Accessibility in Email Marketing. I'm Lauren Cassidy, an Associate Creative Director at Oracle Digital Experience Agency, where I lead a team and focused on creating digital content. I'm thrilled to be joined by my co-host, Sarah Gallardo.
Hi guys, I'm Sarah Gallardo. I'm a lead email developer and email accessibility specialist here at Oracle Digital Experience Agency, where we support Response's clients, but we are not limited to working on any specific ESP. So if you want to use ODX, we are available to meet all of your omni-channel needs.
Sarah, today we're talking about accessibility. Why is it so important?
That is a great question. So I'm going to back up. When we're talking about accessibility in email, we really are just talking about how people with disabilities can access the content in our emails. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, but I wanted to at least start there. And people with disabilities actually make up a substantial portion of Americans, right? 27%. And while that percentage is a little different in different countries, depending on a number of different factors, that number is pretty true across the board. So yeah, people with disabilities absolutely are reading your emails, they're filling out your forms, and they're reading your blog posts.
So how do you think the design and development impacts accessibility and user engagement?
Oh, it absolutely does. Accessible design and development has such a significant impact on user engagement, right? Because we know that people with disabilities represent such a huge amount of people. And we know that they have $21 billion in discretionary income available after taxes and necessities, right? And that's just in the US. So if your digital content is inaccessible, businesses risk alienating this group and leading to lost opportunities, right? We know based on a Forbes study from 2021 during the holiday season that retailers lost about $82 million in sales due to having inaccessible websites.
82 million? That's a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah,
So
it's
what do
kind
we
of
need?
huge.
Yeah. What do we need to do to minimize that risk?
Well, I mean, so there's the financial risk of, not getting those dollars, but there's also some pretty substantial legal ramifications, right? A
Mhm.
lot of people don't know this, but the Americans with Disability Act is only enforceable through lawsuits. Like that is how the act is set up.
Mhm.
So in 2023, there were 4,600 lawsuits filed for digital accessibility. And this is so critical to our industry. 82% of those were in the e-commerce industry. So this absolutely impacts everyone sending emails. It's a big deal.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for showing how accessibility is not just about compliance, but it's about building inclusive relationships and minimizing risks. So let's dive into today's discussion. We'll start by exploring that key area of understanding our clients' accessibility goals and how to align our efforts. And then from there, we'll dive into ideation and integration, focusing on how to incorporate accessibility and design process right from the start. And then we'll also discuss managing change requests and ensuring that those updates are remaining accessible. And then finally, we'll introduce a powerful tool to help you test and refine and enhance the accessibility in your campaigns. So, Sarah, let's jump into our first topic with the importance of accessibility. There are different types of goals from a client, right? So, how
Mhm.
do the creative team understand these types and adjust their approach?
Absolutely. I think whenever we start with a client, it's really important to kind of figure out where they are within this kind of spectrum, right? So on the lower side, we have people who care enough to be aware that they are doing what everyone else is doing. So whether that's good, whether that's bad, really kind of where they're at. Then we have people that are dedicated to meeting those requirements, right? They follow the WCAG. That's where they want to be. And then we have this kind of what I call super accessibility group, where they're not just interested in meeting the WCAG, they want to go above and beyond and really make a good experience for users with disabilities. And that is super fun. But in order to kind of figure out where they are in that spectrum, we have to ask questions that gets to what their accessibility needs are, right? So we can't just kind of ask, hey, do you want this to be accessible? We really have to kind of dig in a little bit deeper, right? So what steps have already been taken towards achieving those accessibility goals, right? Have they already started? Is this brand new to them? That gives you a really great starting point on how you need to communicate to them, right? And then if they've already started into it, what challenges have they already encountered? You know, again, like kind of generally when we're talking about new clients, how can we solve problems? And then also, do they have their own internal accessibility team? Have they already had a lawsuit? Knowing like, and just even where that internal accessibility team is in the process. Like, are they going to review the designs or are they not reviewing anything until UAT proofs are out, right? Understanding that really helps you better understand what you need to communicate to them, what kind of services and opportunities you need to provide to them. And then just even the general, like if they have an internal accessibility team, do they understand kind of what our limitations are in email and how that works? You know, how much are you going to have to kind of walk them through some of this process? So kind of like setting up this baseline understanding, you can really tailor your design and development, but also to kind of help align them with their specific accessibility objectives. So really kind of helping to meet those expectations and the needs of their users. Pretty great.
That's great.
So next, we're going to move on to ideating and accessibility integration, which is one of my favorite things to talk about. And it's not enough to come up with a good design. Lots of designers can do that. But if we can't create that, if we can't translate that into an accessible email, it really isn't communicating. And since email is a communication platform above anything else, it's kind of a big deal when you're not communicating to 27% of your recipients, right? Kind of a big deal.
Right.
And since we've already started that conversation about goals and objectives, we can continue that conversation through this process to kind of make sure that we're constantly realigning to make sure that we're meeting those accessibility goals and staying on track. So, Lauren, what considerations should a creative team take into account when they're ideating for accessibility?
Yeah, so as we begin, I usually look at the project intake, right? So I'm ensure that I have a clear understanding of, both the objectives of the intake and then the resources available to me based on like what client already has in creative, right? So I assess whether the project falls into one of these three categories. So it's either designing with an existing modular system or an atomic design, or is it expanding it or building something entirely new? So from there, I follow a series of action steps. Often I start with a quick discovery audit to get a full picture of what we're working with. So gathering some previous emails or especially looking at the website. How are they using CTAs and live text on there? And then depending on the project type, I make sure I align with the goals and explore how we can push the design decisions, like especially with accessibility in mind. So I prioritize getting connecting with my developer right away and, like trying to avoid any surprises.
And I think we all hate surprises, like more than
Yeah.
anything in the world. We want to plan ahead. We want to get it figured out. Okay.
So we know that not all clients start from modular system in place. And so, but assessing their previous campaigns or digital communications, as I said, was a good first step. So analyzing elements like colors, fonts, live text usage, CTA formatting, we can identify the building blocks that they're of their design language. And so on the screen, you'll see an example of a modular email architecture. The system consists of an interchangeable modules that house our creative content. So by establishing this framework, like with defined styles, you can ensure that consistency across your elements, resulting in like cohesive look and throughout your communications. And so we know that not everybody has this, right? When we start designing in email, we have to define a hierarchy and what the module types are and could be, right? So this all of a sudden you're thinking through heroes, secondaries, tertiary, telling that story and creating that hierarchy. So each module integrates the best practices of both creative and development teams, and you have a greater efficiency and flexibility here. And so, of course, we always allow for updates and adjustments because you're always learning. We live in a digital world, and so there's never a moment where you can't reassess. Now let's take a step back and dive into how we make decisions about the content and the elements that get pulled into these modular creations. All right, let's start with the key aspects. So first off, live text. You're going to hear that a lot. Live text is essential for accessible emails because screen readers and assistive technologies can easily interpret it, making content usable for individuals with visual impairments. So it also adapts to different screen sizes and devices. With live text in place, Sarah, can you walk us through the hierarchy and size of the text?
Absolutely. I think kind of the most important thing to really think about when we're talking about live text is the body copy size, because so many
Mhm.
clients want to fit so much information in here.
Yeah.
But we really want that to be around 14 to 18 pixels, better if we're using a more relative font size that allows for that flexibility. And then from there, we go to larger text for subheadlines and headlines. So it gets, pretty large, but that really is the goal, right?
Yeah.
And then we think about color contrast, right? And I know you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, so many accessibility guidelines, such as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, I'm using that site all the time. And so to really find out where that sufficient color contrast can accommodate my users with low vision and other disabilities. So high contrast colors is really important for readability and even to draw attention to important elements. So Sarah, I know like even within the sample that we have on screen right now, we're using alt text. Can you talk a little bit about images and alt text?
Absolutely. Alt text is critical to help further the communication, right? So alt text is for people that use screen readers, and having that content read to them. So making sure that your alt text is representing whatever that image is communicating is super important. Anybody that knows me knows that I could talk about alt text forever, but that's like the core of what we're doing with alt text, and kind of helping to make sure that we are meeting that need. Outside of images failing to load, which I know is a thing that we talk about all the time in email, but it's not so much of an accessibility thing.
Yeah, the
But
next is clear call to actions. And so with clear CTAs, we like to use actionable language. And so we're not using the word click. That's
no click here, come
that's
on, guys.
yeah. We have to keep that color contrast with by using bold colors and make sure our fonts are clear and simple. And then the strategic positioning shows them the action they need to do next.
Absolutely, it's so important. And I think within that too, making sure that your design is flexible, right? We're not filling
Mhm.
that design with a whole bunch of information, making sure everything is like super, pixel perfect. Letting that flexibility kind of lead the design, so that users can access the content within it however they need to, right? And that includes dark mode too, right?
Yeah. Yeah, like me, I'm a user that use dark mode. And it not only for me, it gives it better readability and it's just more comfortable for me, but especially those with visual sensitivities. And so, Sarah, can you walk us through the Litmus test that we use to ensure the color conversion and contrast?
Yes, this is like one of my most favorite things, right? So brands come to us with an already established brand color or set of brand colors, right? It's part of their standards. So we like to run that through Litmus to kind of have a better idea of what those colors convert to, and invert to, I guess, in dark mode, right? Because like this very beautiful orange color turns into a horrible brown, or a beautiful midnight blue turns into a really weird lavender. So making sure that we understand where those colors are going, helps us be able to kind of design and plan ahead for what that's going to look like in dark mode. And this is such an important tool for our team in general,
Uh,
I think, and part of that intake process.
So scannability is important in email because it helps the user quickly absorb key information. So increasing that likelihood that they'll scroll for more. This also, like when you create these structures, so we have here the inverted pyramid and then the S curve. With mobile responsiveness, sometimes this can create an issue with accessibility. Sarah, can you talk a little bit about the S curve?
I did want to point out we have a bit of an accessibility problem here. That brings us back to our earlier conversation about knowing where your client's goals are, right? So if we have a client that's super focused on accessibility, we are probably going to use a specific approach that we know is more accessible here. And let me kind of back up a little bit, right? There's essentially two different ways we can code this. One is using a desktop show hide, where we have two different images, one that shows up on desktop and one that shows up on mobile. And then we have a directional hack that keeps only, so we only have to use one image and controls whether or not that image is on the right in desktop and then on top in mobile. Kind of a silly problem, but from an accessibility standpoint, using that directional hack actually causes the content to be out of order. So on a desktop, you're kind of bouncing around a lot when you shouldn't be, and that's an accessibility problem. And then we get into background images because using images and text is so important, right? And a background image is a fantastic kind of first step to kind of meeting some of those branding goals, getting that visual appeal and functionality, and being more accessible in general. As long as we're not using VML. I'm not going to go too far into that, but please don't use VML on your background images and CTAs. But making sure that we're kind of thinking about accessibility with these background images is kind of a big deal, right? So we want that live text, right? We've talked about that so many times. We're going to continue to talk about it because it's so important. We know that that live text is important, but we also know that users that use Zoom tools as an assistive technology can increase the size of that text to 200, 300%. And so we need to make sure that that background image can contain that text when it increases that much, right? So super important. And one of the bigger reasons why we're not using images of text so that users can have that control. We also care about live text when we're talking about being able to use the search function in your inbox to be able to get that content. I'm sure I'm not the only person that like inbox dives for promo
Oh
codes.
yeah, I
So
do
important
that.
all the time.
Yeah.
I'm like in line at Michael's, like anyway.
Where's that coupon?
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
We also
for
care about
sure.
like faster load times, and
Mhm.
just branding and engagement. Being able to use a branded font, branded
Yeah.
visuals is super critical, right?
Yeah. And I like in this sample, sorry, in the sample that you had where you break it up and have the live text in a solid color. So that's always a good spot too. But hey, we got to talk about fonts.
We do.
Yeah. All right. So font stacks. I know that, there's several tips that we need to start out with live text, right? So we were talking about compatibility. You mentioned being able to search. Live text is scalable, and it provides some efficiencies. Like when you go into revisions, you can quickly change out stuff without having to worry about images, and even adding personalization. We can easily add a data point within the live text and not have to worry about any images as well. So you mentioned faster load times, but when we think about live text, we have to really consider a font stack. And so a lot of times we have clients that will come in and be like, we want to use our font. And so it's like, okay, what's the stack? And so really understanding that we're selecting fonts that are visually appealing, simple and easy to read. Keeping in mind that the font appearance may vary across email clients. So we've got Gmail versus Outlook. Sometimes Outlook doesn't like to play nice. And so we ensure that
I've noticed.
readability across platforms. And so usually we have, the client font. Sometimes they choose a Google font to back that up. And then we always have that web safe font. And so really that fallback ensures that the fonts are supported. And so it's helpful to know the email clients that are most important to the client as well. So if they think that Outlook is the number one email client, that you really assure them that they like our decision on what the web safe font is. And so I understand that all these fonts will have different widths sometimes, and that causes a problem with font drift. So Sarah, can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So font drift is essentially kind of expecting that this text is going to free flow in these text boxes, right? We have the font stack that's going to adjust how that text looks, but then also talking about, those Zoom tool users, and even browser extensions that can change the formatting of that text, and kind of allowing that to happen, acknowledging that that's going to happen and kind of planning for it to happen. So we really kind of have to think about kind of how that's going to look, and not get dedicated to specific things, right? And I know I feel like I'm always like stabbing designers in the heart when I bring up like we don't want to fully control how that text flows. So we're not going to put a line break in the middle of a headline, right? I know, Lauren, you're like, oh.
This is my favorite thing. No widows, please.
Exactly. And there definitely are some things we can do in code to kind of resolve some of those, but we definitely don't want to use any hard line breaks, because that is going to impact how that works for users that are using some of these assistive technologies. So in order to kind of create that inclusive and accessible kind of experience, we need to make sure that we're really planning for that flexibility. Super important. And speaking of flexibility,
Yeah, the most important CTAs. So using live text and CTA buttons is essential. So we're looking for several things when we're designing a CTA. So we want to make sure that the color contrast is there for readability, and we got to make sure that the font size is legible within our CTA. We want to make sure that the clickability of the entire button is working and not just the text. So, Sarah, would you talk a little bit about the clickability and maybe the list visibility?
sure. So when we're talking about CTAs, making sure that that entire button shape is clickable is super crucial. We'll talk about that more about that in a second. We also want to make sure that we're kind of putting our link to be a standard link, so it shows up in the link list. Keyboard navigators can just easily tab to that link. Super important. And then we want to make sure that everyone can actually activate the link. Back to the VML discussion, that's one of the reasons why VML isn't a good choice, because we can't actually click that link in some situations. Then we also care about what that CTA says and that it's using live text. So those are also super critical accessibility tools. And then we also care, because we're emailers, how that CTA ends up looking in every email client, right?
Yes.
Like there's no way around that.
Yeah.
So that's like why we want to use the kind of padding or border style button to kind of fill out that CTA shape to make sure it's clickable. But then we also kind of have to be aware, like our designers need to be aware, right, Lauren, that that's not always going to be a specific size. That padding and border is going to take up space. So a small word is going to be a smaller CTA. Big word is going to be a bigger CTA, right?
Yeah. And it's visually described here on this slide. I think you could definitely see that it has room for expansion in these samples. So, all right, let's move on to the next topic. And Sarah, I'm really excited about this. The accessible kinetic slider. Can you tell us about that?
Thank you. Yes. So most of the kinetic content that exists for email is not accessible. So I spent probably more time than I should have to kind of discover and adjust and tweak and test this kinetic slider. So it works a lot like your typical carousel, but it doesn't have the left-right controls that usually cause a carousel to not be accessible. Because people that use keyboards or other assistive technologies to access content can't use those left-right controls. So we have this little kind of slider that does essentially the same thing. And it has all the benefits of the carousel, less real estate on screen, being able to kind of show multiple products or services all at once, and without the accessibility problem. So super excited about this. I love talking about it, but it also has better support across many more email clients than the typical carousel does. So that's also a big bonus.
All right, so now that we've covered accessibility in our designs, it's important to remember that it's not a one-time task. So accessibility evolves with feedback and real-world use, right? So let's lead to the next topic and change requests. Some of these approaches that we'll be seeing will help us communicate a little bit better. And so really focusing on the detail of the specific issue is, how can we clearly explain what their suggestion is? Right here we have on the screen is they want to change the CTA color. So they wanted to match the image. We could show them how that impacts accessibility by giving them a visual example and then pointing them back to their goals. So you could see on this slide, we're providing the alternative. This doesn't meet color contrast. And so I suggest if you want to change the CTA to try, a more contrast visible color. So, and then always show that you're demonstrating the commitment of their goals. And so our last tip, having that open dialogue and, inviting them into the discussion and showing them those examples can really help emphasizing your dedication once again to the accessible content. So, Sarah, I think we've got to wrap it up and we've got tools and resources next.
Yep, absolutely. We promised tools and resources, and here we go. So we are super excited and proud to kind of share with you guys our accessibility and inclusive design ideas checklist. So we've got 12 pages chock full of accessibility kind of design basics that your team can use to kind of get a jump start on implementing accessibility into your campaigns, right? So real quick, gonna kind of hit some of the top points. We've broken them down by challenge to kind of make it a little bit easier to kind of digest and process and kind of see what you need to do. So visuals, we're not just talking about blind people. I think that's where everyone jumps to all the time. But we're also talking about people with low vision, people with color blindness, and people with dyslexia, even though dyslexia is a neurological difference and not a visual difference. So really kind of talking about what we can do to kind of improve the experience of our email campaigns for those users. Also hearing considerations, even though in email we really don't have lots of multimedia options, we can still do some video and audio. So making sure that we're meeting the needs of those folks as well, making sure that we're adding captions and transcripts where necessary. And I think this is really important to kind of understand too. 59% of Gen Z users are actually choosing to use captions when they're watching videos, right? And Lauren, I'm sure your kids are probably the same as my kids, where, yeah, I see them use it all the time. Like we're always turning captions on, our Netflix videos or whatever. And that kind of speaks to a bigger kind of concept of the curb cut effect, which is essentially the idea that when we make something accessible, we're also making it better for more users. So it really is a lot of different people that are benefiting when we make something accessible. And then we're also talking about people with cognitive considerations too. We've got our neurodiverse folks, we've got people with like memory issues and other neurological differences that we need to kind of consider. And, I think the focus here really is clarity, making sure that our content is easy to understand and direct and clear. And that can be hard. I think a lot of times we as email marketers get in this rut of thinking that everyone thinks about things the same way we do, has the same experience as us. And so I think this kind of content of thinking about these cognitive considerations really kind of helps us get a little bit outside of that box to really kind of push ourselves. And then lastly, we have a whole section dedicated to motor considerations. which is a pretty sizable and very diverse group of people. And that's where we kind of talk more about, that CTA clickability that we were talking about earlier, how easy it is to scroll our content. If everything is linked in your email, how many problems is that causing for users that have a hard enough time clicking on the thing they want, right? Um, so making sure that we're meeting those needs, and also the needs of people who are just in a temporary or kind of situational issue where they also need these supports is super helpful.
It's the end. Oh
It is the
no.
end. We made
It's the end. But it
it.
doesn't mean you can't Slack us. So please join us on Slack, speakers Lauren Cassidy Sarah Gallardo, and then email us at agencysales_us@oracle.com. We'd love to work with you. QR code here. You can sign up to get our newsletter and stay up to date on all of our latest content. And it's been a really fun day, and I'm excited to
Yep,
talk to you on Slack. See you
absolutely. Thanks,
later.
guys. Bye.